Hey folks, before the video starts, I want to say big thank you for the feedback you gave me in the last video. Again, I will be short and say, as every other video, to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to comment down below, helping me to give proof to YouTube that all of you who follow this channel so far are real people who watch my videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I found a dark website selling live ocean creatures. One of the listings is something I've never seen before, and it's breathing. Alright, so let me start this off by saying I'm not proud of what I was doing when this all started. I wasn't looking for trouble or anything illegal, I swear. But I guess that's how the worst stuff always begins, right? Curiosity, boredom, and a dash of stupidity. It was one of those aimless Friday nights. My roommate was out with his girlfriend, and I was left to fend for myself in our tiny apartment. I had a 6-pack of cheap beer and nothing but time. Naturally, I did what any reasonable adult would do. I went down a YouTube rabbit hole. You know how it goes. You start with a funny video about a guy accidentally driving a boat onto land, and 3 hours later, you're watching some conspiracy theorist explain why the moon is hollow. Somewhere in that mess, I stumbled across a video about the dark web. The guy in the video made it sound like this forbidden, dangerous corner of the internet where you could find anything. And I mean anything. Drugs, stolen identities, hitmen, the usual spooky stuff you've probably heard about before. But then he said something that really grabbed my attention. It's not all bad. Sometimes you find really weird niche communities or marketplaces that sell unusual things. Unusual things. I don't know why that part stuck with me, but it did. So, fueled by a mix of curiosity and probably too many beers, I decided to see if I could find it myself. Just to poke around, you know? Nothing illegal, just exploring. Now, before you think I'm some kind of hacker, let me clear that up. I'm not. Not even close. But with a little Googling and a Tor browser download, I was in. It didn't take long to find out that most of the dark web is honestly boring. Forums, sketchy-looking shops, and a lot of dead links. Not exactly the treasure trove of secrets I'd been expecting. I was about to give up and call it a night when I found a link labeled Abyssal Emporium. The name sounded ominous, but in a cool way. The description underneath read, "Exotic marine specimens and treasures from the depths." No questions asked. It sounded more like an eBay store for marine biologists than anything shady. My curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked. The page was simple, almost plain. A black background with white text and a grid of listings. At first, it seemed harmless enough. There were tanks of jellyfish, rare types of coral, and bioluminescent shrimp. Honestly, it was kind of fascinating. Each listing had pictures, descriptions, and prices. A lot of it looked way too expensive for anyone who wasn't a millionaire or a hardcore aquarium enthusiast. Then, about halfway down the page, things started getting weird. There was a section called Specimens Under Observation. The first few listings were still kind of normal, odd, but not terrifying. There was an octopus with transparent skin, a crab that glowed like a glow stick, and something they called a fangfish that looked like it swam straight out of a horror movie. But as I scrolled further, the photos became less recognizable. One listing showed what looked like a lump of flesh in a glass container. The description read, "Deep sea organism, unclassified, behaviors observed, rapid regeneration, and sensitivity to light." Another was labeled living mass, origin unknown. The picture was so blurry, I couldn't even tell what I was looking at, but the description casually mentioned it had attempted to breach containment twice. I probably should have stopped there. A normal person would have clicked away, closed their laptop, and gone to bed. But me? Number I was too intrigued, too stupidly curious. So, I kept scrolling. That's when I found it. The listing had no name, just a serial number, X17 breathing specimen. The photo was dark, but you could see enough to know this thing wasn't normal. It looked like a massive, coiled mass of tentacles, but they weren't smooth like an octopus's. They were rough, covered in what looked like sharp, spiny ridges. At the center of it all was a circular, gaping mouth, or what I thought was a mouth, ringed with teeth that seemed to spiral inward. The description read, "Recovered from Mariana Trench, 2023. Specimen is alive. Exhibits signs of respiration and possible cognition. Handle with extreme caution." But what really got me was the last line. Currently available for live purchase. Shipping arrangements required. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. This had to be fake, right? Some kind of messed up art project or a prank. But there was a part of me, a really stupid part, that wanted to believe it was real. And that part had me hooked. I didn't plan on buying anything. Seriously, what would I even do with it? But I wanted to see how far I could go. I clicked the listing, and a form popped up asking for my email. Against my better judgment, I typed in my burner address and hit submit. That's when the screen went black. For a moment, I thought my laptop had crashed, but then a single line of text appeared. Await further instructions. Alright, so let me pick up where I left off. After the site told me to await further instructions, I sat there staring at my screen, wondering what kind of rabbit hole I had just fallen into. It was late. My beer buzz was wearing off, and reality was starting to creep back in. The smart move would have been to shut my laptop, delete my browsing history, and pretend this whole thing never happened. But then, around 2:30 a.m., my phone buzzed. It wasn't a notification. It was my burner email app. I swear, when I saw the subject line, my stomach dropped. X17 breathing specimen. Purchase confirmation. Purchase confirmation. I hadn't bought anything. I didn't even put in payment info. My first thought was that it was some kind of phishing scam. But when I opened the email, it was different. The email was short, almost too short. No logos, no fancy formatting, just a block of plain text. Thank you for your interest in specimen number X17. Delivery logistics are currently being arranged. Expect correspondence within 72 hours. For inquiries or cancellations, reply with ABORT. That's it. No contact info, no links, no way to trace it. It was like the email had been plucked out of nowhere. I stared at the screen, half hoping the beer was messing with my head. But no, it was real. I thought about replying with abort, but part of me hesitated. I didn't actually think they were going to send me anything, right? I mean, this was probably just some elaborate troll, some bored weirdo on the dark web messing with gullible idiots like me. That's what I told myself as I deleted the email and shut my laptop. But even after I crawled into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept hearing the phrase, delivery logistics, over and over in my head. It felt too specific, too real. The first sign. The next day was normal enough. I went to work, came home, and tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. I even told myself I wouldn't check my burner email again. If this was a prank, I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of engaging. That lasted until about 8 p.m. when something weird happened. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through Instagram, when I heard a thunk from outside my apartment. It wasn't super loud, but it was distinct, like something heavy being dropped on the ground. My first thought was that it was one of my neighbors. I live in a pretty crappy building, and people are always moving in or out, hauling furniture up and down the narrow stairwell. But when I looked out the peephole, there was no one there. Now, my building isn't exactly in the safest part of town, so I didn't just fling the door open. Instead, I cracked it an inch and peered out. Sitting on the doormat was a small black package. No address, no labels, nothing. I opened the door and hesitated before picking it up. It was heavier than it looked, like it was filled with sand or something dense. I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen counter, just staring at it, like it was about to explode. The rational part of my brain was screaming not to open it, but curiosity won out. Inside was a small metal cylinder. It looked like one of those thermoses you'd use for soup, but sleeker, more high-tech. There were no markings on it except for a small digital screen on the side that displayed a single word: active. I didn't even know what to do with it. There were no instructions, no clue as to what was inside. For a moment, I thought about throwing it out, but something about it felt important, like it wasn't just some random junk. It felt deliberate. I put it on a shelf and decided to leave it alone for the night. I didn't want to admit it, but the thing kind of scared me. I figured I'd deal with it in the morning. The second email, around midnight, my burner email pinged again. I almost didn't open it. I really didn't want to, but my curiosity got the better of me. This one was even shorter than the last. Delivery complete. Activation underway. That was it. No details, no explanation, just those two sentences. I glanced over at the metal cylinder sitting on the shelf. The word active on the screen seemed brighter now, almost like it was glowing. I decided to take a closer look. As I picked it up, I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint vibration. The whole thing was humming, like there was a small motor running inside. I turned it over, looking for some kind of latch or button, but there was nothing, just smooth, featureless metal. And then, as I was holding it, I felt it move, not like a vibration or a shift in weight, but an actual, deliberate movement, like something inside was pushing against the walls of the cylinder. I dropped it immediately. It hit the counter with a metallic clang, and the humming stopped. The word active on the screen flickered and disappeared. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. The noise. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that thing sitting on the shelf, waiting for me to fall asleep, so it could, I don't know, do whatever weird breathing metal cylinders do. Around 3 a.m., I finally got up and decided to get rid of it. I didn't care what it was. I just wanted it out of my apartment. But when I went to grab it, it was gone. I swear, I checked everywhere. The shelf, the counter, even the floor in case it had rolled off somehow. It was just gone. And that's when I heard it. A faint, wet, slithering sound. It was coming from the corner of the room, near the window. My heart was pounding as I turned, half expecting to see some kind of giant, tentacled creature waiting to pounce. But there was nothing there, just the sound, like something was dragging itself across the floor. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch with every light in the apartment on, clutching a kitchen knife, like it was going to save me if whatever was making that noise decided to show itself. But the sound never got closer. It stayed near the window, faint but constant, until the sun came up. The update. The next morning, I checked my burner email again. There was a new message waiting for me. Specimen transitioning. Maintain secure environment. Observe only. Do not interfere. I didn't reply. I didn't even close the email. I just stared at the screen, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. What did they mean by specimen transitioning? What the hell had I brought into my home? And more importantly, how the hell was I supposed to get rid of it? I didn't go to work the next day. I couldn't. Every sound in my apartment had me on edge. The faint hum of the fridge, the creak of the old floorboards. It all felt wrong, like something had shifted, like my space wasn't mine anymore. And then there was the slithering noise. It hadn't stopped. It was quieter now, almost imperceptible, but if I sat still long enough, I could hear it. The faint, wet drag of something moving across the floor. Whatever was making the noise stayed out of sight, lurking in the corners of the room, but it was there. I knew it was there. By noon, I was losing it. I hadn't touched the burner email since the last message, but the words "observe only" kept running through my mind. What the hell was I supposed to be observing? I hadn't seen anything yet, just heard it, but that almost made it worse. At least if I could see it, I'd know what I was dealing with. I decided to do a sweep of the apartment. Call it desperation, call it stupidity. I just needed to do something. Armed with a flashlight and my roommate's old baseball bat, I started with the corners of the living room, where I'd first heard the noise. Nothing. I checked under the couch, behind the TV stand, even the vents. Still nothing. Then I noticed something strange. The hardwood floor near the window looked wet. Not soaking, but like there was a thin, oily film coating the surface. I crouched down to get a better look, shining the flashlight over it. The liquid was clear, but sticky, and it smelled faintly of salt water. It led to the window. The window. Now, here's the thing. I live on the 3rd floor of a crappy old building. There's no fire escape on my side, no balcony, just a sheer drop to the alley below. The windows are old, single pane, and barely even open. But when I ran my hand over the frame, I noticed the seal was loose, like something had been pried open. My first thought was that maybe someone or something had come in during the night. But the weird thing was, there were no footprints, just that slimy, wet trail leading to the window, and then stopping. I leaned out to check the sill, but there was nothing there. No marks, no drips, nothing. It was like whatever made the trail had vanished into thin air. I closed the window and locked it tight, but the unease didn't go away. If it had come in that way, what was stopping it from coming back? The tank. I spent the rest of the day jumping at every little sound, pacing around my apartment like a lunatic. I didn't want to check my email again, but I couldn't stop thinking about that last message. Specimen transitioning. Transitioning into what? And where the hell was it? Around 7 p.m., I noticed something else. My roommate's fish tank, a tiny little thing with a couple of goldfish in it, was murky. Normally, he's obsessive about keeping it clean, but the water had turned this weird, cloudy gray. And the fish, they weren't swimming. They were just floating near the top, barely moving. One of them looked like its scales were peeling off, like it had been burned or something. I leaned in closer, and that's when I saw it, a shadow darting through the water. It was too quick to make out any details, but it definitely wasn't one of the goldfish. It was bigger. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it into the tank, trying to get a better look. At first, all I could see was the murky water swirling around, but then it came into view, and my stomach turned. It looked like a tiny version of the thing from the photo on the website. A coiled, spiny mass, about the size of a golf ball, writhing at the bottom of the tank. Its tentacle-like appendages were wrapped around a rock, and at the center was that same gaping circular mouth, slowly opening and closing. Breathing. I stumbled back, nearly knocking the tank over in my panic. The thing didn't react. It just stayed there, pulsing rhythmically, like it was completely at home in the water. How the hell had it gotten into the tank? I thought back to the metal cylinder and the oily trail on the floor. Had it hatched? Was that what they meant by transitioning? The message. I was still staring at the tank, trying to figure out what to do when my laptop chimed. Another email. My heart sank as I walked over to check it. Specimen adaptation complete. Do not relocate. Monitor behaviors. Further instructions to follow. That was it. No explanation, no guidance, just a demand. Monitor behaviors. Was this some kind of experiment? Did they expect me to take notes like I was some kind of scientist? I glanced back at the tank. The thing inside it wasn't moving anymore. It had coiled itself tighter around the rock, almost like it was sleeping, but the water was still clouded, and the goldfish were now floating belly up. I couldn't do this. I couldn't just sit here and monitor behaviors while this thing took over my apartment. I grabbed my phone and called my roommate, hoping he'd come home and give me some kind of sanity check. "Hey man," I said as soon as he picked up. "When are you coming back? Something weird is going on here." There was a pause. Not for a few days. I'm staying with Rachel this week, remember? What's going on?" I didn't want to explain over the phone, so I just muttered something about a plumbing issue and hung up. Great. I was on my own. The movement, around midnight, I heard it again, the slithering. But this time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the tank. I turned on every light in the apartment and approached the tank slowly, my flashlight in one hand and the baseball bat in the other. The water was still cloudy, but I could see the creature more clearly now. It had grown. Not a lot, but enough to notice. Its tentacles had stretched out, and the spiny ridges looked sharper, more defined. And then it moved. It uncoiled itself from the rock and slithered upward, pressing its body against the glass. Its mouth opened and closed rhythmically, almost like it was tasting the air. For a moment, I thought it was looking at me, watching me. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, it slammed against the side of the tank. The glass shook, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. It hit the tank again, harder this time, and I swear I saw a crack form near the bottom. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed the entire tank, water and all, and hauled it into the bathroom. I dumped the water and the creature into the bathtub, slamming the shower door shut, like that was going to hold it. The thing writhed, slapping its tentacles against the porcelain as it tried to move. Without the water, it looked even more alien, like something dredged up from the bottom of the ocean. Its skin glistened, and I could see faint, bioluminescent veins running along its body. I locked the bathroom door and backed away, my heart pounding. What the hell was I supposed to do now? The warning. As I sat on the couch, trying to calm down, my laptop chimed again. Another email. Containment breach, imminent. Relocation not advised. Evacuate immediately. Do not contact authorities. Evacuate? Where the hell was I supposed to go? And why couldn't I call anyone? Before I could even think about what to do next, I heard a loud crash from the bathroom. The glass shower door had shattered. The sound of the shattering glass froze me. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the baseball bat so tightly, my hands hurt. My mind was racing with every worst-case scenario. The thing slithering out of the bathroom, hunting me down, wrapping itself around me like some deep-sea nightmare. And then I heard it again, the wet, slithering noise. Louder this time, closer. I stood up, bat in hand, and crept toward the bathroom. Every step felt like I was walking toward my own execution. The air in the apartment felt heavier, thicker, and I swear there was a faint, salty smell, like ocean water, but mixed with something rotten. When I reached the bathroom door, I paused. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. The slithering noise had stopped, replaced by a faint, rhythmic tapping, like something hard was striking the porcelain tub. Tap, tap, tap. It was almost purposeful, deliberate. Finally, I mustered the courage to open the door. The tub, the bathroom, was a wreck. The shower door was in pieces, shards of glass scattered across the tile. The tub was filled with water again, even though I had drained it earlier. The thing must have somehow clogged the drain, or forced the water back up. It was still in there, coiled at the bottom of the tub, its tentacles twitching like it was agitated. But that wasn't the worst part. It was bigger now, much bigger. The thing was nearly the size of a basketball, and its tentacles had grown longer and thicker, the spines along their length sharper and more pronounced. Its bioluminescent veins pulsed faintly in the dim bathroom light, casting an eerie bluish glow over the walls. And it wasn't just sitting there anymore. It was moving, slowly, deliberately. It was dragging itself up the side of the tub, its tentacles suctioning to the porcelain with an awful wet sound. Its circular mouth opened and closed, revealing rows of jagged, inward-facing teeth that glistened in the faint light. I stepped back, heart pounding, and accidentally kicked a shard of glass. The noise made the thing pause. Its tentacles froze mid-motion, and then, God help me, it turned toward me. It saw me, the chase. I don't know how I knew it, but I could feel it. The way it moved, the way it froze, and then adjusted its position. It wasn't just reacting to sound. It was aware. It was watching me, and then it moved. Fast. It launched itself out of the tub with a sickening, wet smack, landing on the floor and writhing toward me. I screamed, full on, no shame screamed, and bolted out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I could hear it slapping against the door, its tentacles sliding along the wood, searching for a way out. For a split second, I thought the door might hold. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. I ran. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and my phone, and threw open the front door. The hallway outside was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes every tiny noise seem deafening. Behind me, I heard the bathroom door give way, followed by the now familiar slithering noise. It was in the apartment. I didn't wait to see if it was following me. I bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet in my rush to get out of the building. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the cold night air, gasping for breath. The streets. I didn't have a plan. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. My apartment wasn't safe anymore. I wasn't safe anymore. I started walking, sticking to the main roads where the streetlights made everything feel slightly less terrifying. But even out in the open, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow, every alleyway, felt like it was hiding something. At one point, I heard a noise behind me, a faint, wet slapping sound that made my blood run cold. I spun around, bat raised, but there was nothing there, just an empty sidewalk and the distant hum of traffic. I kept moving. The warning. About an hour later, my phone buzzed. I'd almost forgotten I was still carrying it. When I pulled it out, I saw another email waiting for me. Specimen breach confirmed. Containment protocols failing. Evacuate urban area immediately. Await further instructions. Urban area. Was this thing loose in the city now? Was it growing? I didn't reply. I didn't even think about replying. I just kept walking, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do. Call the cops. Tell them I had a deep sea monster loose in my apartment. Yeah, that'd go over well. Then I remembered something. The package, the metal cylinder. It was still in the apartment. Or at least, it had been. What if there was something in there I was supposed to use? Some kind of containment device or kill switch? I didn't know. All I knew was that I couldn't just leave this thing out here to do whatever it was planning to do. I needed to go back. The return. When I reached the building, it was quiet. Too quiet. The streetlights outside flickered faintly, casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement. The front door was ajar, hanging slightly off its hinges, like something had forced its way through. I stepped inside, gripping the bat tightly, and made my way up the stairs. The hallway was dark, the overhead lights buzzing faintly. My apartment door was wide open. The smell hit me first. That same salty, rotten odor, but stronger now. It was almost suffocating. I stepped inside, my shoes sticking to the floor, which was coated in that same oily, clear liquid I'd seen before. The trail led into the living room, and there it was. The creature had grown again. It was massive now, easily the size of a large dog, its tentacles sprawling across the floor. The spines along its body were longer, sharper, glinting faintly in the dim light. Its circular mouth was gaping wide, revealing those rows of jagged teeth, and it was pulsating, like it was breathing heavily. And in the middle of the room, just a few feet from the creature, was the metal cylinder. The screen on its side was flashing now, displaying a single word in bold red letters. Terminate. The decision. I don't know what I was expecting. Some kind of weapon. A button that would make the thing disappear. But there was nothing on the cylinder. No switches, no handles, no obvious way to use it. The creature shifted, one of its tentacles slapping against the floor with a sickening thud. It was watching me again, its glowing veins pulsating faster, more erratically. I had to act. I grabbed the cylinder and lunged toward the creature, raising the bat in my other hand. I didn't have a plan, but I figured if this thing wanted the cylinder so badly, I wasn't about to let it have it. And that's when it moved. Faster than I thought possible, it lashed out with one of its tentacles, wrapping around my leg and pulling me to the floor. The bat flew out of my hand, clattering across the room. The creature loomed over me, its mouth opening wider, the rows of teeth glinting in the faint light. Desperate, I slammed the cylinder against its body. There was a high-pitched whine, followed by a burst of light. The creature recoiled, its tentacles flailing wildly. The light grew brighter, filling the entire room, and the last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of the creature's screech, a horrible, guttural noise that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. When I came to, the apartment was empty. The creature was gone. The cylinder was gone. And I was left sitting in the middle of my ruined living room, surrounded by the faint smell of salt water. But I knew it wasn't over. When I woke up on the living room floor, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the normal kind of quiet, though. It was unnatural. No hum from the fridge, no faint creak of the old pipes, not even the sound of traffic outside. Just nothing. My head was pounding, my leg was sore where the creature had grabbed me, and my apartment looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Furniture was overturned, the walls were smeared with that oily residue, and the air still reeked of salt and rot. But the thing itself, gone. No sign of it, no trail, no indication of where it might have gone. I sat up, wincing as pain shot through my leg, and tried to piece together what had happened. The last thing I remembered was the burst of light and that awful screech. The cylinder was gone too, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it had done wasn't permanent. The aftermath. The first thing I did was check my phone. My burner email app had another message waiting for me. I didn't even want to open it, but I couldn't stop myself. Event contained. Status. Inconclusive. Monitor for residual activity. Do not disclose. Inconclusive. What the hell did that mean? And what the hell did they mean by residual activity? My apartment was trashed. My mind was scrambled. And now they were telling me I had to monitor for something that could have easily killed me. I tossed my phone onto the couch in frustration and just sat there. What was I supposed to do now? Pretend none of this had happened? Go back to work and act like I hadn't spent the last 48 hours being hunted by some deep-sea monstrosity? The residue. I spent the next couple of hours trying to clean up the mess. I didn't even know where to start. The walls were streaked with that clear, oily film, and no matter how much I scrubbed, the smell wouldn't go away. Every time I wiped a surface, the rag came away slimy, like the stuff was somehow seeping out of the walls themselves. Then there were the cracks. The hardwood floor near the bathroom had splintered where the creature had slammed into it, and the tub was stained with faint, glowing streaks. No matter how much I scrubbed, the glow wouldn't fade. And that's when I noticed something even worse. The fish tank. It was still sitting in the bathtub, where I'd left it. But the water inside wasn't murky anymore. It was crystal clear. Too clear. It almost looked unnatural. I leaned in closer, my stomach churning, and saw that the bottom of the tank was coated with tiny translucent eggs. The patterns, the days that followed, were a blur. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. Every noise, every shadow, made me jump. I kept expecting to hear the slithering sound again, to see the thing reappear in the corner of the room, but it never did. But something was happening. My apartment wasn't normal anymore. The lights flickered constantly, even after I replaced the bulbs. The walls creaked and groaned, like the building itself was settling in ways it shouldn't. And the smell, that awful salty stench, never completely went away. Then there were the patterns. At first, I thought I was imagining them, but the more I looked, the more I saw them. Faint, circular shapes etched into the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. They were almost invisible in normal light, but under the glow of my flashlight, they stood out like scars, and they were spreading. The stranger. About a week after the incident, there was a knock at my door. I froze. No one ever knocked on my door, and I wasn't exactly in the mood for visitors. But the knocking didn't stop. It was slow, methodical, almost like whoever was on the other side knew I was inside. I grabbed the baseball bat, my new constant companion, and crept toward the door. When I looked through the peephole, my stomach dropped. There was a man standing there, wearing a plain black suit. He wasn't holding a clipboard or a badge or anything official looking, just standing there with his hands at his sides. His face was blank, expressionless, and his eyes, there was something wrong with them. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared straight ahead, almost like they were looking through the door. "Mr. Hayes?" he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "We need to talk about the specimen." I didn't answer. I didn't even breathe. I just stood there, gripping the bat, praying he would go away. But he didn't. "Mr. Hayes," he said again, "we know you're in there. Open the door." I backed away slowly, trying not to make any noise. That's when he did something that made my blood run cold. He pressed his hand against the door, and I heard a faint clicking sound, like a lock being picked. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted for the fire escape. The escape. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the city. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have any money, just the clothes on my back and my phone. I ended up crashing at an old friend's place, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. But even there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I went back to my apartment to grab some essentials, but the building was different. The windows were boarded up. There was caution tape across the entrance, and a sign that read, "Condemned. Do not enter." I didn't even try to go inside. I just turned around and walked away, leaving everything I owned behind. The last email. A few days later, I got one final email on my burner account. It was short, just like the others. "Observation complete. Event concluded. Do not attempt further access to Abyssal Emporium." And that was it. No explanation, no apology. Just a cold, clinical statement, like I'd been part of some experiment I hadn't agreed to. I deleted the email, deleted the account, and threw my phone in the nearest dumpster. The conclusion. It's been a few months now, and I've tried to move on. I've moved to a new city, got a new job, and I don't go near the dark web anymore. But every now and then, I still hear it. That faint, wet, slithering sound. I tell myself, it's my imagination, that the creature is gone, that it's over. But deep down, I know the truth. It's still out there. And whatever it's doing, it's not done. I'm a security guard for a high-profile client. The dark web says his family keeps clones in the basement. Last night, I heard someone call for help. All right, so before I dive into this, I need to be upfront. I'm not some deep web conspiracy nut, and I sure as hell don't believe every creepypasta I see floating around online. But when something brushes up against your real life in a way that's too messed up to ignore, you start rethinking everything you thought you knew. I work as a private security guard. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills and keeps me out of trouble. About 6 months ago, I landed this gig that sounded too good to be true. Watching over the property of a high-profile family. The job ad was vague, but the pay was insane. Like, double my usual rate insane. The only catch? It was a live-in position at a mansion out in the middle of nowhere, and the contract made it clear that confidentiality was non-negotiable. They even had me sign an NDA before I stepped foot on the property. The mansion was straight out of a movie. Gated driveway, endless gardens, and a house so big I'd get lost in it. My quarters were in this separate little building on the edge of the property, but most of my job involved patrolling the perimeter and monitoring cameras. Seemed simple enough. The family was odd, but not in a way that set off alarms at first. Mr. Greenfield, not his real name, obviously, was this buttoned-up CEO type. His wife, Margot, was polite but distant, and their teenage son, Jack, was the brooding, headphone-wearing type. They didn't interact with me much, which I was fine with. My job wasn't to be their buddy. It was to keep the property secure. Now, here's where things started to get weird. About 2 months in, one of my coworkers, Dave, mentioned something offhand during a shift change. He said, "You know, some people online think this family's hiding something, like big time. You ever hear the clone theory?" I laughed it off at the time. Clone theory? What, like science fiction clones? "Yeah, man," he said, lowering his voice, like the walls were listening. Supposedly, the Greenfields are into some deep web crap. There's a subreddit that claims they've got this lab under the house where they, experiment on clones. People who look exactly like them. Now, I'm not an idiot. This smelled like the kind of nonsense people post on the internet for kicks. But Dave wasn't joking. He even pulled up a post on his phone. A grainy black and white photo of a man that looked like Mr. Greenfield. Only off. His face was too symmetrical, almost doll-like. The caption read, "Clone number 7, seen leaving the Greenfield estate in 2020. I brushed it off, but the seed was planted. The night, it got real. One of the biggest perks of the job was the quiet. Nothing ever really happened out here. Just the occasional raccoon tripping a motion sensor or a random delivery truck showing up unannounced. But a couple of nights ago, while I was on the night shift, I heard something that froze me solid. I was in the security office, flipping through the camera feeds. Everything looked normal. The driveway, empty. The gardens, quiet. The basement entrance, locked like always. But then I heard it, a voice, faint and muffled, coming from my radio. At first, I thought it was just interference, or some prank from another guard. But then I made out the words, "Help me." I yanked my radio off my belt. "Dave, you there?" Static. "This isn't funny, man." No response. The voice came again, clearer this time. It was a woman. Her voice was shaking, like she was trying to stay quiet, but couldn't hold it in anymore. "They won't let me out. Please, if anyone can hear me." And then, just like that, it was gone. Dead silence. I stared at the radio like it might explain itself. My gut said it was someone screwing with me, but there was something wrong about the way her voice sounded. She didn't sound like a prankster or even someone trying to mess with security. She sounded desperate. I checked the cameras again, my hands suddenly clammy. Still nothing out of the ordinary. But then I remembered something. The cameras don't cover everything. The Greenfields had insisted on keeping the basement completely off limits, not just to us guards, but to the cameras too. Down the rabbit hole. The next morning, I cornered Dave in the break room. "You hear anything weird on the radio last night?" He gave me this confused look. "Nah, man, I wasn't even on duty." "Why?" I told him what I'd heard, half expecting him to laugh it off, but instead, his face went pale. "Dude, that's creepy as hell. You think it's..." He didn't have to say it. I knew he meant the clone theory. I shook my head. It's probably just interference or something. Dave didn't look convinced. You think you could, I don't know, check the basement? Are you crazy? That's like the one thing they told us not to mess with. He shrugged. Yeah, but if you're hearing voices, what if someone's actually down there? The idea stuck with me all day. I couldn't shake the thought of that voice, how genuinely terrified it sounded. I kept replaying it in my head, convincing myself it had to be a trick, until I remembered something. The mansion had a backup generator. It was down in the basement. If there was some kind of interference messing with my radio, the source would be down there. That was a logical excuse, right? At least that's what I told myself. That night, I waited until my shift was nearly over. The house was dark, the family long since asleep. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the basement door, trying to keep my footsteps quiet. The door was locked, of course, but I had the master key. My heart was pounding as I slid it into the lock and turned it. The door opened with a soft click, and a cold, stale draft hit me in the face. The basement smelled off, like mildew and something metallic. I took a deep breath, stepped inside, and started down the stairs. That's when I heard it again. The same voice, only this time it wasn't coming from my radio. It was coming from below me. Help me! The stairs creaked under my boots, each step echoing in the silence. I gripped the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached, the cold metal handle digging into my palm. That voice, it was faint, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. It didn't sound like it was crying out anymore. It sounded like it was waiting. The basement was colder than I expected, not your usual damp chill, but the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. My breath came out in soft puffs, visible in the beam of the flashlight. The smell got stronger the farther down I went, that metallic tang almost gagging me. It was blood. It had to be. When I reached the bottom, my light hit a cement floor and walls lined with shelves, stacks of old, forgotten stuff, paint cans, boxes of books, random knickknacks. Nothing sinister yet, but the space felt wrong. It wasn't just the cold or the smell. It was like the air itself had weight, pressing down on me, making my chest tighten. The voice didn't call out again, but I swear I could feel it, pulling me forward. I panned the flashlight across the room, looking for anything out of place. At first, I didn't see much, just the usual basement clutter. But then the beam landed on something that stopped me cold. A door. It was set into the far wall, almost hidden behind a shelf that looked like it had been hastily shoved aside. Unlike the rest of the basement, which was old and a little dingy, the door was pristine, sleek and metallic, with no handle, just a keypad. I knew I shouldn't mess with it. I could practically hear my boss's voice in my head. Stay out of the basement. But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I approached the door, shining my light on the keypad. It was a simple setup. Numbers, a small screen, nothing fancy. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. The screen was faintly lit, like it had been used recently, and there, smeared across the keypad, was something dark and sticky. Blood, fresh blood. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to lock the door and pretend I hadn't seen a thing. But then I heard it again. Help me? It was louder this time, clearer, and it was definitely coming from behind that door. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst, but I couldn't walk away now. Someone was back there, someone who sounded terrified, someone who might actually need me. I tried a few random combinations on the keypad, hoping for a miracle, but of course, nothing worked. Frustrated, I stepped back, scanning the room for anything that might help. That's when I noticed the small desk in the corner. It was cluttered with papers and what looked like maintenance logs, but my eyes went straight to a sticky note slapped on the side of a monitor. Scrawled in messy handwriting were 4 numbers: 0, 4, 2, 7. It can't be that easy, I thought, but I didn't waste time second-guessing. I punched the code into the keypad, my fingers trembling. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft beep, the screen turned green, and the door slid open with a quiet hiss. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. The lab. The room was massive, way bigger than the basement should have been. It didn't feel like part of the house at all. It felt industrial, like something out of a hospital or a high-tech lab. The walls were lined with stainless steel cabinets and medical equipment, the air humming faintly with the sound of machines. And then there were the tanks. They were lined up in rows, these huge glass cylinders filled with some kind of bluish liquid. Inside each one was a person, or at least something that looked like a person. I walked closer, my legs moving on autopilot. The first tank held a woman, her eyes closed, her face eerily calm. She looked normal, almost too normal, like someone you'd see on the cover of a magazine. But as I moved to the next tank, I started noticing the imperfections. The man in the second tank had a face that was slightly off. His nose was too small, his skin too smooth. It was subtle, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The third tank was worse. The person inside had no hair, no eyebrows, no nails, just pale, waxy skin stretched tight over bones. I stopped at the fourth tank, my stomach turning. The thing inside was barely human. Its face was twisted, one eye larger than the other, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its mouth hung open, revealing teeth that looked like jagged shards of glass. That's when I noticed the plaques at the base of each tank. They were numbered. Number 1, number 2, number 3, and so on. But they also had names. Names I recognized. Greenfield. Every single tank had the name Greenfield engraved on it, followed by a number. Greenfield number 4, Greenfield number 5, Greenfield number 6. My head was spinning. What the hell was I looking at? Clones? Failed experiments? I didn't have time to process it, because that's when the voice came again. Louder, closer. Please, help me. I'm in here. The sound was coming from the far end of the room, near a small metal door. I sprinted toward it, my flashlight bouncing off the walls. The door wasn't locked this time. It opened easily, revealing a small, dark chamber. Inside was a woman huddled on the floor. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with tears. She looked up as the light hit her, and her expression shifted from fear to relief. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You heard me. You actually heard me." I stepped inside, crouching down to help her up. "Who are you? What the hell is going on here?" Her eyes darted toward the door, and she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You have to get me out of here. They'll be back any second." "Who?" I asked, my voice rising. "Who's coming?" Before she could answer, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps above us. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving toward the basement stairs. The sound of footsteps above us hit like a bucket of ice water. Slow, deliberate, and far heavier than anyone in the Greenfield family should have been. I snapped off the flashlight, plunging us into darkness. The woman's grip on my arm tightened, her nails digging into my skin. She was trembling so hard I could feel it. "Who's up there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't answer, just shook her head violently, her breath hitching in shallow gasps. My brain was running in overdrive, trying to figure out what the hell I'd gotten myself into. Whoever, or whatever, was upstairs didn't sound like they were in any rush. The footsteps paused for a moment, then resumed, each one making the old wooden floor above us creak. We didn't have long. "Is there another way out of here?" I asked, keeping my voice as low as possible. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She finally nodded, pointing to the far corner of the room. I strained my eyes, trying to make out what she was pointing at. Then I saw it. A vent. The grate was partially loose, barely clinging to the wall. It was a tight fit, but it was better than sitting here, waiting for whatever was upstairs to find us. I motioned for her to follow and crept toward the vent as quietly as I could. Every step felt like an eternity. Behind me, she shuffled forward on her hands and knees, moving slower than I would have liked. The footsteps above us stopped again, directly over our heads this time. My heart felt like it was trying to claw its way out of my chest. For a moment, there was silence. No creaks, no breathing, just a suffocating, heavy stillness. Then came the sound of the basement door creaking open. They're coming down. Into the walls, I reached the vent and yanked the grate free, the old screws giving way with a metallic screech that made both of us freeze. My blood ran cold as the sound echoed through the basement. There was a pause, and then the footsteps sped up, thudding heavily down the stairs. Whoever, or whatever it was, they weren't walking anymore. They were running. "Go!" I hissed, shoving the woman toward the vent. She hesitated for a split second, her eyes wide with fear, before crawling inside. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, just as I hauled myself into the vent, pulling the grate up behind me as best as I could. The space was tighter than I expected, the metal walls pressing against my shoulders. The woman was ahead of me, crawling frantically, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Behind us, I heard the unmistakable sound of something entering the room. The air in the vent was thick and stale, the metallic smell stronger than ever. My knees and elbows screamed in protest as I dragged myself forward, trying not to think about what was behind us. I couldn't see much, but I didn't need to. I could feel it. Something was following us. The faint scraping of claws or nails against metal echoed in the vent, and I was getting closer. "Keep moving," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "Don't stop." We reached a junction in the vent. One path sloped upward, the other deeper into the maze of ducts. She paused, looking back at me with wide, panicked eyes. "Which way?" she mouthed. I had no idea. The map of the mansion in my head was useless now, but I knew one thing. We needed to get out of this vent before whatever was following us caught up. The upward path looked promising, so I pointed toward it. She nodded and started climbing, her movements frantic and jerky. Behind us, the scraping got louder. Whatever was back there wasn't crawling, it was running. A glimpse of it. We scrambled upward, the incline making every movement harder. My palms were slick with sweat, and I could feel the metal cutting into my skin. Just as the vent leveled out again, I risked a glance back. I wish I hadn't. In the faint light from the grates behind us, I saw a figure. It was too big for the vent. Its shoulders hunched unnaturally as it clawed its way forward. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over a grotesque, elongated face. Its eyes were wrong. They glowed faintly in the darkness, but not like an animal's. They looked hollow, like windows into something that shouldn't exist. And its teeth, jagged, uneven rows of teeth, glinting in the dim light. The thing opened its mouth, and I expected a growl, or a scream, or something primal. But instead, it spoke. "You're not supposed to be here." Its voice was low and guttural, like it was speaking through a mouthful of gravel. Hearing it was worse than seeing it. My body froze for a split second, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get as far away as possible. The woman grabbed my arm, snapping me out of it. "Move," she hissed, her voice trembling. I didn't need to be told twice. The hidden passage. We reached another grate, this one hanging loosely from the wall. Beyond it, I could see a dark, narrow corridor, maybe a service tunnel, or some kind of utility passage. I kicked at the grate with all the strength I had left, the metal finally giving way with a loud clang. The woman went first, dropping into the corridor and landing hard on her hands and knees. I followed, my legs buckling as I hit the ground. My chest was heaving, my lungs burning from the effort. But we couldn't stop. Not yet. The thing in the vent was still coming. I grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "This way," I said, not even sure where I was leading her. The corridor stretched out in both directions, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. One end disappeared into darkness. The other led to a heavy, rusted door. We sprinted for the door, our footsteps echoing in the narrow space. I could hear the thing behind us, its claws scraping against the walls of the vent as it tried to force its way out. We reached the door, and I threw myself against it, shoving it open with all my weight. Beyond the door was another basement, smaller, older, and far more sinister. The walls were lined with cages. Some were empty, their doors hanging open, but others weren't. Inside the cages were people. At least, I think they were people. The caged ones, they were emaciated, their skin pale and stretched tight over their bones. Their eyes followed us as we entered, wide and unblinking. One of them reached out through the bars, their fingers impossibly long and thin. "Don't let it find you," they whispered, their voice barely audible. The woman froze, staring at the cages in horror. "What is this place?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. All I knew was that we couldn't stay here. I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward another door at the far end of the room. Behind us, the sound of metal tearing echoed through the corridor. The thing was out of the vent. We ran, the caged figures reaching out for us as we passed. Their whispers followed us, a chorus of warnings and pleas. "It's coming. You can't escape. Don't let it take you." We reached the door, throwing it open and slamming it shut behind us. I slid the heavy bolt into place, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage it. The woman was leaning against the wall, her face pale, her chest heaving. "What was that thing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know, but I had a feeling we weren't safe yet. The bolt on the door felt flimsy, the kind of flimsy that wouldn't hold if something as determined as the thing we'd just escaped decided to test it. My hands were shaking as I backed away, my breath ragged and shallow. The woman slid down the wall to sit on the floor, her head in her hands. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice breaking. She didn't look up, her fingers trembling as they brushed strands of hair out of her face. "They call it a watcher. I don't know what it is, but it's not human. Not anymore. Her words settled like lead in my stomach. Not anymore? What the hell did that mean? I wanted answers, but there wasn't time. The sound of claws scraping against the other side of the door snapped us both back to reality. It followed us, I whispered. No, she said, her voice low and shaking. That's not the same one. There's more. Into the heart of the labyrinth, the door rattled violently, and my stomach dropped. I wasn't about to wait around to see if the bolt would hold. I grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet. We've got to keep moving. She didn't argue this time. We hurried deeper into the new basement, a maze of narrow corridors lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The air here was damp and heavy, the smell of mildew mixing with something sharper, something chemical. The walls were lined with pipes that hissed and dripped, their rusted surfaces covered in strange, almost organic-looking growths. The woman stuck close behind me, her footsteps soft but frantic. Every turn we took felt like a gamble. There were no signs, no indication of where we were going, just the oppressive hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant muffled sounds of something, footsteps, machinery, voices. I couldn't tell. The corridor opened into another room, this one even stranger than the last. The walls were lined with monitors, each one displaying grainy black and white footage from around the mansion. I recognized the main living room, the kitchen, the driveway, and the basement we'd just left. On one of the screens, the watcher stood in the room with the cages. It was pacing slowly, its grotesque form hunched over as it sniffed the air like some kind of predator. The cage figures shrank back as it passed, their faces contorted in silent terror. The woman let out a small gasp. It's looking for us. I tore my eyes away from the monitors, scanning the room for anything useful. There was a desk covered in papers and what looked like schematics for the mansion, but I didn't have time to decipher them. What caught my attention was a heavy, industrial-looking door on the other side of the room. It had no handle, just a card reader and a keypad. Do you know the code? I asked her, my voice tight. She shook her head, her eyes darting between me and the monitors. I don't even know where we are. I cursed under my breath, running my hands through my hair. The keypad was a dead end unless we could guess the code, and we didn't have time for that. But the desk, maybe there was something there. I started rifling through the papers, scanning for anything that looked like a password or keycard. The footsteps were louder now, echoing down the corridors. Not just one set, several. My hands moved faster, panic clawing at my throat. Finally, I spotted it. A keycard tucked under a stack of folders. I grabbed it and swiped it across the reader. The machine beeped, and the door slid open with a mechanical hiss. Come on, I shouted, pulling her through. The door closed behind us with a thud, locking automatically. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the machinery in the room we'd entered. The observation room. This room was different. It was cleaner, colder, and far more clinical. The walls were lined with glass windows, and beyond them, I could see people, or at least things that looked like people. Each window was like a scene out of a nightmare. In one, a man sat perfectly still on a metal chair, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were open, unblinking, and his skin looked waxy, almost like plastic. In another, a woman stood in the center of a small, stark room, her arms hanging limp at her sides. Her head jerked occasionally, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. The worst was the third window. Inside was a figure strapped to a table, its body covered in deep, jagged scars. Tubes snaked into its arms, pumping some kind of dark, viscous fluid into its veins. Its chest rose and fell shallowly, like it was barely alive. When I leaned closer, I realized with a jolt that its face was eerily familiar. It looked like Mr. Greenfield. "What is this place?" I muttered, my voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. She was staring at one of the windows, her face pale. I followed her gaze and saw another figure, a young boy sitting cross-legged on the floor, his face buried in his hands. He was rocking back and forth, whispering something I couldn't make out. "Is that Jack?" I asked, my throat dry. "No," she said softly. "Not the real one. The realization." The pieces were falling into place, and I didn't like the picture they were forming. Clones, experiments, replacements. The Greenfields weren't just hiding secrets, they were creating them. But for what purpose? And how many of these things were out there? The woman grabbed my arm suddenly, her nails digging into my skin. "We can't stay here. This room, this is where they monitor them. If they see us..." Her words were cut off by a loud, mechanical hiss. The door behind us was opening. I turned, my heart slamming against my ribs. A figure stepped into the room, its movements slow and deliberate. It wasn't a watcher. It was something worse. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit. But his face was wrong. Too smooth, too symmetrical, like someone had sculpted it out of wax. His eyes locked onto us, unblinking and devoid of anything resembling emotion. "Unauthorized personnel," he said, his voice flat and robotic. "Return to your quarters immediately." The woman backed away, her face pale. That's one of the handlers." I didn't wait to find out what a handler could do. Grabbing her hand, I bolted for the far door. The handler didn't chase us. He didn't need to. As we reached the exit, I glanced over my shoulder and saw him raising a small device in his hand. The lights in the room flickered, then died, plunging us into darkness. The chase. The door opened into another corridor, and we ran, the woman's breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Behind us, the sound of metal boots echoed against the floor. The handler was following us now, his movements steady and unhurried, like he knew we couldn't get away. "What do we do?" I shouted, my voice bouncing off the walls. She didn't answer. She just kept running, her eyes scanning every door, every turn, looking for an escape. The corridors were endless, a labyrinth of cold, gray walls and flickering lights. And then we saw it, a staircase at the end of the hall, leading up. Hope surged in my chest. If we could just make it upstairs, maybe we'd find a way out. Maybe. The handler's voice boomed behind us, cutting through the air like a blade. "Return to containment." The lights overhead exploded one by one, showering us in sparks. The woman screamed, and I grabbed her arm, pulling her up the stairs 2 at a time. The air grew warmer as we climbed, the oppressive cold of the basement, giving way to the familiar stale air of the mansion. We burst through the door at the top of the stairs, slamming it shut behind us. I bolted it without thinking, my hands trembling. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the sound of scratching. The scratching at the door wasn't frantic or wild. It was deliberate, almost measured, like whoever or whatever was on the other side wanted us to know they weren't in a hurry. Each scrape sent a shiver down my spine, my hand still resting on the bolt, like it was my last line of defense. The woman was pacing, her arms wrapped around herself, like she was trying to keep from unraveling. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes darting to every shadow in the room. We were in what looked like a storage area, boxes of supplies stacked haphazardly, dust coating everything. The air was thick, and the silence between the scratches felt like it might suffocate us. "What do we do now?" I whispered. She stopped pacing, her eyes locking onto mine. "We can't stay here. If they've sent a handler, it means they're onto us. And if the handlers don't catch us..." She trailed off, her face pale as she glanced at the door. "What?" I pressed. "If they don't catch us, what happens?" She swallowed hard. "The Watchers will, and they don't bring you back." The mansion's secrets. We crept through the storage area, finding another door that led to a long, dark hallway. I recognized it. It was part of the mansion I'd patrolled dozens of times before, but it felt different now. The walls seemed closer, the shadows deeper, like the house itself had shifted somehow. The woman stayed close behind me, her footsteps eerily silent. "You don't understand," she whispered. "This place, it isn't just a house. It's a system. Everything here is controlled, watched. Even when you think you're alone, you're not." "What are they watching for?" I asked, glancing over my shoulder. She hesitated, then said, "To make sure we don't leave." Her words sent a chill down my spine. We turned a corner, and suddenly I was staring at something I didn't recognize. A door I'd never seen before, tucked into a shadowed alcove. It was heavy, reinforced, with a small window set into the top. Through the glass, I could see a faint, pulsing red light. "What's in there?" I asked, keeping my voice low. She shook her head. "I don't know. That's where they keep them." "Keep what?" I demanded, but she didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the door, wide and glassy with fear. Glimpse. Behind the curtain, the scratching noise had stopped, but the silence was worse. I felt like something was pressing against my skull, a buzzing sensation that made my teeth ache. I couldn't help myself. I moved toward the door, my curiosity clawing at me, even as every instinct screamed to leave it alone. "Don't!" she said sharply, grabbing my arm. Her nails bit into my skin. "You don't want to see." But I did. Or maybe I didn't, and something else was driving me. I reached for the small lever on the window, flipping it open. The red light inside intensified, casting an eerie glow across the hallway. At first, I couldn't tell what I was looking at. The room was massive, far bigger than it should have been, the walls lined with more of those glass tanks. But these tanks weren't like the ones I'd seen in the basement. These were broken, shattered, their contents spilling out onto the floor in a viscous, dark liquid. And among the shards and the fluid were shapes, human shapes, but twisted, mangled, like they'd been abandoned halfway through creation. One of them twitched. I slammed the window shut, stumbling back. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. The woman grabbed my arm again, her face pale and drawn. "I told you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They don't always get it right." The green fields. We kept moving, the mansion's halls stretching out endlessly. Every room felt darker, heavier, like the walls were alive and watching us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded, pushed towards something. The woman seemed to sense it too, her movements growing more frantic, her breathing shallow. And then we found them. The Greenfield family was in the main living room. Mr. Greenfield, his wife, and their son Jack sat on the couch, perfectly still, their eyes fixed on the dark, dead television. They didn't react as we entered, didn't even blink. It was like they were statues, or puppets waiting for someone to pull the strings. "What's wrong with them?" I asked, my voice trembling. The woman shook her head. "Those aren't the Greenfields. Not anymore." I moved closer, against my better judgment, waving my hand in front of Mr. Greenfield's face. Nothing. No flinch. No movement. But as I leaned in, I noticed something horrifying. Their skin wasn't real. It was like a thin layer of wax stretched tightly over something else. The longer I looked, the more I saw the imperfections, the seams along their necks, the faint mechanical whirring coming from inside their chests. "They've been replaced," the woman said. "The real Greenfields. They're probably in the lab, or worse." "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why would anyone do this?" She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. The answer was everywhere. Control, power, experimentation. The Greenfields weren't just participants in whatever this was. They were the architects, and now they were its victims. The final stand. The lights flickered violently, and a deep, guttural roar echoed through the mansion. The sound was inhuman, primal, and it was coming closer. I didn't need to look to know what it was. "The Watcher," she whispered. "It's found us." We ran. I don't even remember which direction. Just away from the roar, away from the Greenfields, away from everything. The mansion twisted around us, its halls stretching impossibly long, its doors leading to places they shouldn't. It was like the house itself was alive, trying to keep us in. Finally, we burst into the foyer. The front door was ahead, the moonlight streaming through the glass panels. Freedom. We sprinted for it, but just as we reached the threshold, something slammed into the wall behind us. I turned, and there it was, the Watcher. It was bigger now, its body twisted and contorted, its limbs too long for its frame. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, everything stopped. The air grew thick, the room silent, and I felt like it was looking through me, into something deeper. Then it moved. The woman shoved me forward, her voice sharp. "Go! Get out!" I didn't want to leave her, but instinct took over. I stumbled through the door, the cold night air hitting me like a shock. Behind me, I heard a scream, hers, then silence. I turned back, but the door was gone. The mansion was gone. I was standing in the middle of the forest, the trees stretching high into the night sky. My breath came in shallow gasps, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The aftermath. It's been a week. I don't know how I made it back to civilization. The authorities didn't believe me, of course. The Greenfields mansion, it doesn't exist, at least not on any map. But sometimes, at night, I hear scratching at my door, deliberate, measured, and I know it's not over. I found a dark web page detailing secret lab experiments. One of the subjects matches my childhood photo. Hey guys, so this isn't the kind of thing I usually post about. I'm not a storyteller or anything, and honestly, I debated whether I should even share this. But the more I think about it, the more I feel like I need to tell someone, maybe just to get it off my chest. Or maybe because someone else out there has seen what I saw. Let me start by saying, I'm not some tech-savvy hacker or anything. I'm just your average dude who spends too much time online. A few weeks ago, I got curious about the deep web. You know, that shady part of the internet that everyone talks about, but no one really admits to visiting. I'd been watching a ton of YouTube videos about it. Stories of creepy chat rooms, illegal markets, and weird conspiracy pages. They were fun to watch, but always felt more like urban legends than anything real. One night, I decided to check it out myself. Stupid idea, I know, but I wasn't planning on buying drugs or hiring hitmen or anything like that. I just wanted to see what was out there. For the record, I'm not proud of this, and if you're thinking about doing the same thing, just don't. Anyway, I downloaded a Tor browser and started browsing. At first, it was kind of disappointing. Most of the sites were either dead links or super boring, just pages full of random text or sketchy looking forums. But then I stumbled onto a link that stood out. It was titled something like the Looking Glass Project. The name alone was enough to grab my attention, so I clicked on it. The page took forever to load. When it finally did, the layout was super basic, just a black background with plain white text. At the top, there was a single sentence: "Truth is stranger than fiction." Underneath that, there was a list of links, each labeled with a code. Things like subject number 027-B or experiment log number 12. Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked on the first one. The screen changed to a document with what looked like a scanned page from an old notebook. There were handwritten notes and diagrams of a human brain, all labeled with scientific terms I didn't understand. The text below it was typed out, and it described some kind of experiment involving neural augmentation. Apparently, they were trying to enhance the cognitive abilities of test subjects by implanting microchips into their brains. The notes mentioned things like heightened perception and involuntary memory retrieval, but it also described side effects: migraines, paranoia, and in some cases, psychotic breaks. At first, I thought it was some kind of elaborate hoax, like an alternate reality game or a creepy pasta someone had uploaded to mess with people. But the further I read, the more convinced I became that this wasn't fiction. The level of detail was insane. There were dates, names of researchers, all redacted, and even photos of medical equipment. I kept clicking through the links, going deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. Each page described a different experiment: sensory deprivation chambers, genetic modification, even something about trying to create artificial telepathy. The documents didn't explain who was funding these experiments or where they were taking place, but there were enough clues to make it seem like this was happening somewhere very real. I should have stopped there. I knew I should have stopped, but I didn't. I couldn't. That's when I clicked on a link labeled subject number 044-A. The page that loaded was different from the others. Instead of a document, there was a series of photographs. They showed a young boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sitting in a sterile-looking room. He had messy brown hair, big eyes, and this blank expression, like he was scared, but trying not to show it. Something about him felt familiar. Below the photos, there was a description of the experiment. The boy had been part of a trial to study developmental plasticity. According to the notes, the researchers had taken children from orphanages and subjected them to a series of tests designed to maximize latent potential. They didn't go into detail about what those tests were, but they mentioned things like isolation, sensory overload, and psychological conditioning. The more I read, the more my stomach turned. I was about to close the page when I noticed something in one of the photos. The boy was holding a stuffed animal, a faded blue rabbit. My heart stopped. I knew that rabbit. It was the same one I had as a kid. I felt a lump rise in my throat as I scrolled back up to the boy's face. That's when it hit me. The kid in the photo looked exactly like me. I don't remember how long I sat there staring at that screen, but it felt like hours. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence. Lots of kids probably looked like that at his age, right? And blue stuffed rabbits aren't exactly uncommon. But the more I stared at that photo, the more certain I became. That kid was me. I should probably explain. When I was little, like around 6 or 7, I spent some time in foster care. My parents passed away when I was really young, and while my grandmother eventually took me in, there were a few years where I bounced around different homes. Most of my memories from that time are blurry, probably because I was too young to really process everything that was happening. But there are fragments, snapshots of moments that come back to me sometimes. One of those fragments is the blue rabbit. I don't remember where I got it, but that rabbit was my lifeline during those years. It was always with me. I even slept with it every night. But at some point, it disappeared. I don't remember losing it or throwing it away. It just wasn't there anymore. And I never really thought about it again until now. I clicked through the photos again, hoping I'd find something, anything, that proved this was some kind of mistake. There were 6 pictures in total. Most of them were just the boy sitting in that sterile room, staring blankly at the camera. But the last photo was different. It showed him strapped to a chair, wires attached to his head and chest. His eyes were wide open, his mouth frozen in what looked like a scream. I couldn't tell if he was actually screaming or if it was just the way his face looked in that moment, but it sent chills down my spine. Below the photos, there was a paragraph of text. I forced myself to read it, even though every fiber of my being was screaming at me to stop. Subject number 044-A exhibited signs of heightened sensory awareness following procedure number 7, including improved auditory and visual acuity. However, prolonged exposure to the stimuli resulted in severe psychological distress. Subject terminated after phase 3 due to non-compliance and self-harm risk. Terminated. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. Was this some sick way of saying they killed him? I felt like I was going to throw up. But then I noticed something else. The dates. The notes were dated from the early 2000s, specifically 2003. That was the same year I would have been around the boy's age. The timing lined up perfectly. I leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding in my chest. None of this made sense. How could I have been part of some secret experiment without remembering any of it? And if that boy was me, how was I still alive? According to the notes, I had been terminated. I tried to brush it off as a weird coincidence, but the more I thought about it, the more pieces started to fall into place. I'd always had weird gaps in my memory from when I was a kid. Little things, like not remembering what school I went to in 1st grade, or why I have no pictures from before I was 8. And then there were the nightmares. I've had them for as long as I can remember. Dreams about bright lights, loud noises, and a voice that kept telling me to hold still. I always thought they were just random nightmares, but now I wasn't so sure. I started to panic. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely move the mouse, but I forced myself to close the page. I didn't want to see any more. I told myself I'd just imagined the whole thing, that it was all some elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I tried to go to bed, but I couldn't stop thinking about the photo. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that boy's face staring back at me. I barely slept that night. And when I finally did drift off, I had the worst nightmare I've ever had. I was strapped to a chair in a dark room, just like the boy in the photo. There were wires attached to my head, and a blinding white light was shining down on me. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. Then I heard a voice, cold and emotionless, saying, "Initiate phase 3. The light got brighter and brighter until it felt like my whole body was on fire. And then I woke up, gasping for air. That should have been enough to scare me off for good, but I couldn't stop thinking about the website. I needed answers. I needed to know if what I'd seen was real, or if I was just losing my mind. So the next day, I went back on the deep web and tried to find the page again, but it was gone. I don't mean I couldn't find the link. I mean the entire site had vanished. Every link, every document, every photo, gone. It was like it had never existed. I even tried searching for it on forums and Reddit, hoping someone else had seen it and could back me up, but I found nothing. It was like the whole thing had been wiped from the internet. That's when things started getting really weird. Later that week, I noticed a black SUV parked across the street from my apartment. I live in a quiet neighborhood, so it stood out immediately. At first, I didn't think much of it, but the car didn't leave. It was there the next day, and the day after that, always parked in the same spot, always empty, or at least it looked empty. One night, I got brave, or stupid, and decided to check it out. I waited until it was dark, then crept outside with a baseball bat in hand. My plan was to sneak up on the car and see if anyone was inside. But when I got there, it was gone. Just vanished. I don't even remember hearing it drive away. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, I've started noticing other things. I hear strange noises at night, like faint static, almost like a radio that's not quite tuned to a station. Sometimes, I wake up and feel like someone's been in my apartment, even though the doors are locked and nothing's missing. And then there's the dreams. They're getting worse, more vivid, more real. And every time I dream, I see the boy who might be me. After the SUV vanished, I told myself it was just paranoia. Maybe it was a neighbor's car, or maybe I was so worked up that I imagined the whole thing. But the static, I couldn't explain that away. The first time I heard it, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. It was late, probably around 2 or 3 a.m. Everything was dead silent, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat. Then, out of nowhere, I heard this faint crackling sound. It was so soft, I almost didn't notice it at first, but once I did, it was impossible to ignore. It reminded me of an old TV trying to pick up a signal, just a low, constant hiss, with these occasional bursts of louder static. I sat up, straining to hear where it was coming from. My first thought was that it was a neighbor's TV, or maybe some interference from a radio. But the sound wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside my apartment. I got up and started checking everything: the TV, the router, my phone, even the microwave. But nothing was turned on. The static kept getting louder, and it was starting to make my head hurt. I finally tracked it down to my computer. The monitor was off, but the speakers were hissing softly, like they were picking up some kind of signal. I unplugged them, and the static stopped immediately. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I chalked it up to some kind of interference, maybe a neighbor's Wi-Fi or a passing truck. But that night, it happened again. Same time, same sound. This time, it wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from my phone. When I picked it up, The screen was black, like it had powered off, but as soon as I touched it, the screen flickered to life. For a split second, I saw something. A face, I think, but it was gone before I could really register it. The phone restarted itself, and when it turned back on, everything seemed normal. No weird apps, no strange messages, nothing. But I knew what I'd seen. The static became a nightly occurrence after that. Sometimes it came from the speakers, sometimes the phone, and sometimes it felt like it was just in the air, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It wasn't loud, just loud enough to be noticeable, but it was relentless, and it was always accompanied by this feeling, like someone was watching me. Not in the normal paranoid way, but like there were actual eyes on me, the kind of feeling that makes your skin crawl. I thought about telling someone, but who would I even tell? The cops? What would I say? Hey, I think my computer speakers are haunted. I didn't have proof, and even if I did, I wasn't sure I wanted anyone else involved. Whoever, or whatever, was doing this clearly didn't want me talking about it. But then something happened that made me realize I wasn't imagining any of this. One night, I was lying in bed, listening to the static, when my phone buzzed. It was a text. I grabbed it, expecting it to be a spam message, or maybe one of my friends drunk texting me. But when I unlocked the phone, the message was blank. No sender, no text, just an empty notification. I stared at it for a second, unsure what to think. Then, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. It was a picture of me. Not a selfie, not something I'd taken. It was a picture of me sitting at my desk, staring at my computer screen. The room was dark except for the glow of the monitor, and I looked terrified. I didn't even remember taking that photo, and judging by the angle, I couldn't have taken it. Someone else had been in my apartment. Before I could process what was happening, another photo came through. This one was even worse. It showed me sleeping in my bed. The angle was from above, like it had been taken from the ceiling. My eyes were closed, and the blue glow from my phone screen lit up my face. I could feel my chest tightening as I realized the implications. Someone had been in my apartment while I was asleep. I jumped out of bed and turned on every light in the place, grabbing the baseball bat I'd kept near my door since the SUV incident. I checked every corner, every closet, every window, but there was no sign of anyone. The locks were still in place, and nothing looked out of order. It was like they'd never been there at all, but they had been. I knew it. After that night, the static changed. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was voices. Faint, garbled voices, like someone was speaking through a broken microphone. I couldn't make out most of what they were saying, but every now and then, I'd catch a word or two. Compliance, monitor, subject. The more I listened, the more I realized they were talking about me. One night, I recorded the static on my phone, hoping I could analyze it later and maybe figure out where it was coming from. But when I played the recording back, there was nothing there, just silence. It was like the static didn't exist unless I was hearing it in real time. And then came the email. It showed up in my inbox around 4 a.m. with no subject line and no sender. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. The email was short, just one sentence. Stop searching, or phase 3 will begin. I felt my blood run cold. Phase 3. That was the same term I'd seen on the dark web page. The same thing they'd said about the boy, about me. I wanted to delete the email and pretend I'd never seen it, but before I could, a second email came through. This one had an attachment. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to open it, but I couldn't help myself. I tapped the file, and a video started playing. The footage was grainy, like it had been filmed on an old security camera. It showed a dimly lit room with a metal chair in the center. The same chair from the photo. The same chair from my nightmares. A figure stepped into view, wearing a lab coat and a surgical mask. They were holding a clipboard and writing something down. Then, the camera zoomed in on the chair. Someone was sitting in it. A boy, no older than 6 or 7, with messy brown hair and a blue stuffed rabbit in his lap. He wasn't moving. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his eyes blank and lifeless. And then the boy turned his head, slowly, deliberately, and he looked directly into the camera, directly at me. I slammed my laptop shut so hard, it nearly toppled off my desk. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. That boy, me, looking straight into the camera. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible, but it was. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Every logical part of me wanted to dismiss it as a hoax, a deepfake, something explainable. But deep down, I knew it wasn't fake. It felt too real. The boy's blank stare, the faint hum of the camera, it was all burned into my brain, as real as anything I'd ever experienced. I didn't know who had sent the video or how they'd gotten my email, but one thing was clear. They were watching me, and they wanted me to know. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat on the couch clutching the baseball bat, every muscle in my body tensed like a coiled spring. By the time the sun came up, I had decided 2 things. First, I needed to get out of my apartment, and second, I needed to figure out what the hell was going on. I packed a bag with whatever I could grab, clothes, my laptop, my phone charger, and headed for my car. I didn't even bother locking the door behind me. I didn't care anymore. Let them take whatever they wanted as long as they left me alone. My plan was to drive to my grandmother's house, about 2 hours away. She didn't have internet, didn't even own a smartphone. It felt safe, disconnected. But as I pulled out of the driveway, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The black SUV was back. It was parked a few houses down, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel, but I forced myself to keep driving. I didn't look back. The drive to my grandmother's was uneventful, but the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every car that came up behind me felt like a threat. Every shadow in the trees a pair of eyes watching. By the time I pulled into her driveway, I was a nervous wreck. My grandmother was surprised to see me, but she didn't ask too many questions. She's always been the kind of person who believes in giving people their space, which I appreciated more than ever. I told her I just needed to get away for a while, and she didn't press me for details. I spent the rest of the day helping her around the house, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of dread gnawing at my insides. That night, I felt safe for the first time in weeks. My grandmother's house was old and creaky, but it felt solid, comforting. I curled up on the couch and drifted off, the static and the nightmares finally leaving me alone. But the peace didn't last. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a soft humming sound. At first, I thought it was just the old fridge in the kitchen, but then I realized it was coming from my bag, specifically from my laptop. I hadn't even turned it on since leaving my apartment, but now the screen was glowing faintly, the hum growing louder. My stomach turned to ice as I unzipped the bag and pulled out the laptop. The screen was on, but it wasn't showing my desktop. Instead, it was a black screen with a single line of white text. Phase 3 begins now. Before I could react, the screen flickered and changed to another video. This one was clearer than the last, almost high definition. It showed a hallway lined with doors, the walls stark white and fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The camera moved forward, the lens bouncing slightly, as if the person filming was walking. I wasn't controlling it. I couldn't pause it, couldn't close the window. The video just kept playing. The hallway ended at a large metal door with a keypad next to it. The person filming entered a code, 044A, and the door clicked open. The camera stepped inside, revealing a room filled with monitors, each one displaying a different live feed. Some showed empty hallways, others showed sterile-looking labs, and a few showed what looked like holding cells. Each cell had a single occupant, men, women, even children, sitting on metal cots, staring blankly at the walls. Then, the camera panned to one monitor in particular. My heart stopped. It was showing me. Sitting on my grandmother's couch, clutching the laptop and staring at the screen. The angle was from above, like a security camera mounted in the ceiling. I looked up instinctively, but of course, there was nothing there. The camera in the video kept panning, finally settling on a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was the same man from the first video, the one in the lab coat and surgical mask. But this time, he wasn't alone. Standing next to him was another figure, smaller, thinner, a boy. The boy, Mister. They were both staring directly into the camera. The screen went black. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I think I screamed. I might have thrown the laptop across the room. The next thing I knew, my grandmother was shaking me, her voice full of panic. She kept asking what was wrong, but I couldn't find the words to explain. How do you tell someone that you're being haunted or hunted by your own past? The laptop was fried. The screen was cracked, and it wouldn't turn on no matter how many times I pressed the power button. Part of me was relieved. Whatever it was, it couldn't get to me anymore. At least that's what I told myself. But that was a lie. The static came back the next night, louder than ever. It wasn't just in my head this time. My grandmother heard it too. She kept asking if there was a storm coming, or if the power lines were acting up. I didn't have the heart to tell her the truth. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the static stopped. For a moment, everything was silent, peaceful. Then the lights went out. My grandmother screamed, and I stumbled toward her in the dark, my hands outstretched. But before I could reach her, a voice echoed through the house, a voice I hadn't heard in years, but recognized instantly. It was mine, my childhood voice. Phase 3 is complete. When I heard my own childhood voice echoing through the house, my body locked up. My legs refused to move, my mind frozen in a whirl of terror. It wasn't just hearing the voice. It was the way it sounded, layered with static and warped, like it was playing through a broken cassette. It came from every direction, reverberating through the darkened house. Phase 3 is complete, the voice repeated, softer this time, like a whisper trailing through the walls. My grandmother grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What is that?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" I didn't know what to say. How could I explain that the voice she was hearing was mine, that the horrors I'd brought into her house had now taken root here? I pulled her close, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself this wasn't real. And then the lights flickered back on. At first, I thought the nightmare had ended. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, like the air was pressing down on us. But when I turned to check on my grandmother, I saw her staring past me, her eyes wide with fear. "Who is that?" she whispered. I turned slowly, every nerve in my body screaming not to look. Standing at the far end of the hallway was a figure, small, motionless, a child. It was him, the boy from the videos, the boy from the photo, the boy who was me. He stood there in the dim light, his head tilted slightly, his eyes locked onto mine. He was wearing the same clothes as in the photo, the plain white shirt, the faded jeans, and clutching the same blue rabbit I hadn't seen in decades. But his face wasn't right. It was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were hollow, like two empty sockets. Yet somehow, I could feel him staring straight into my soul. I wanted to move, to grab my grandmother and run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor. The boy took a step forward, his bare feet making no sound on the hardwood. "Why did you leave me?" the voice said. But it didn't come from him. It came from inside my head. It was my voice, but not distorted, broken, layered with static. The boy took another step, and then another. With each movement, the air around us grew colder. My breath fogged in front of me, and I could see my grandmother's trembling hands clutching her sweater. I don't, I stammered, but the words wouldn't come. My mind was racing, trying to piece together a response, a defense, anything. "You left me there," the voice said again, louder this time. "You forgot." Suddenly, the memories came flooding back, like a dam breaking in my mind, images I'd buried for years, locked away in the deepest corners of my brain. The cold metal chair, the blinding lights, the sound of voices, clinical, detached, asking questions I didn't understand, the blue rabbit in my lap, the only thing that felt real. And then, the pain, needles, wires, a searing white-hot agony that seemed to go on forever. I remembered the voice, the same one from my nightmares, saying, "Subject number 044-A is unfit for progression. Reset and transfer to secondary program." They hadn't killed me. They'd erased me, or at least they'd tried to. "I didn't leave you," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "They made me forget. Before I could finish, the boy lunged. His movements weren't human, jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being yanked by invisible strings. He was on me in an instant, his icy hands gripping my arms with impossible strength. His face was inches from mine, and I could see now that his hollow eyes weren't empty at all. They were filled with static, swirling, shifting, buzzing with faint whispers. "You forgot me," he hissed, his voice overlapping with static. "You're not real. I am." The lights flickered again, and for a split second, everything changed. I wasn't in my grandmother's house anymore. I was back in the lab, the same sterile white walls, the same metal chair, the same smell of antiseptic and fear. I was strapped down, wires snaking from my arms and legs. A shadow loomed over me, faceless but familiar, holding a clipboard. "Subject number 044-A is non-compliant," the shadow said. Its voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Prepare for reintegration." "No," I screamed, thrashing against the restraints. "I'm not going back. I'm not." The world snapped back into focus. I was in the hallway again, lying on the floor, my grandmother shaking me violently. The boy was gone. The lights were steady. Everything was quiet, but something was different. Office. I stumbled to my feet, my head pounding. My grandmother was crying, asking me over and over what had happened, but I barely heard her. My eyes were drawn to the mirror at the end of the hallway, the one we'd passed 1,000 times without noticing. There was something in it. It wasn't my reflection. It wasn't me. The figure in the glass was the boy. He stood there, staring at me with those hollow, static-filled eyes, his hands pressed against the inside of the mirror like it was glass holding him in, and then he smiled. It was the first time I'd seen him show any emotion, and it wasn't a child's smile. It was cold, cruel, knowing. Phase 3 is complete, his voice echoed in my head one last time. And then he was gone. I don't know how to end this. I don't know if it has ended. The static stopped after that night, and the emails haven't come back. But every time I pass a mirror, I catch something out of the corner of my eye. Just for a second. A flicker of movement. A shadow that doesn't match mine. I don't think it's over. I think it's waiting. Watching. Maybe for me to forget again. Or maybe it's waiting for phase 4.